I think everyone here knows that being biased is not a good trait. Our teachers, judges, and officials should never be biased. Now, when we take a step back and look at the everyday citizen, we can see how biases may affect them in their daily lives and how it can be shaped by the culture around them. Most of us here would like to believe that we're not biased towards anyone. We're not sexist, we're not racist, we're not ageist, nor do we believe in any stereotypes. Regardless, there are many underlying biases that can influence our everyday lives. This is the concept of our unconscious or implicit biases. The term, first coined back in 1995 by psychologists Mazarin Punji and Anthony Greenwald, they argued that social behavior is largely influenced by unconscious associations and judgments. Now, I know what you may be thinking. How can we be biased and not even know about it? Well, all starts our most important organ, our brain. Every single time we perform an action, our brain processes through thousands and thousands of pieces of information. Sometimes, the amount of information our brain takes in can be too much for it to handle all at once. It'll take the experience from our past encounters and filter out the unnecessary information. This way, it can establish patterns that we can then use to make decisions in the future. But why does our brain need to do this? If it didn't, then we'd have to sit and think about every single action we perform, from picking up a pencil to drinking water and even reading. These mental shortcuts make it faster and easier for our brain to sort through all of the overwhelming data and stimuli we are met with every second of the day. Phrases like rules of thumb, educated guesses, and using common sense are all forms of mental shortcuts. Implicit bias can result when we take one of these mental shortcuts inaccurately. As a result, we incorrectly rely on these unconscious beliefs to provide guidance in a very complex world. This is especially true when we are under high levels of stress. We are more likely to rely on these patterns and to examine all of the relevant and surrounding information. Now, these biases can be formed in a lot of ways, and one of the major sources are influences from the media. The media has become increasingly accessible over the past few years, and while that has many benefits, it can also lead to implicit biases. The way a TV show portrays an individual, or the language an article uses to describe an event, can ingrain specific biases in our minds. For example, they can lead us to associate Black people as criminals or females as nurses or teachers. The way you are raised and your individual upbringing can also contribute to the rise of implicit associations. One research study found that parental attitudes towards certain demographics can influence a children's implicit prejudice. And parents are not the only figures who can influence such attitudes. Siblings, teachers, and the culture in which you grow up in can play a huge role in shaping your explicit and implicit beliefs. Implicit biases can take on a whole multitude of paths, and one of the most common is gender biases. Now, this is something we've all heard of before. Gender biases are the ways in which we judge men and women based on traditional feminine and masculine assigned traits. In the school setting, girls are more likely to be associated with subjects such as language over math, whereas boys are more likely to be associated with math over language. This reveals clear gender-related implicit biases that can ultimately go so far as to dictate future career paths for those individuals. Another example, which pertains to an increasingly revolutionary movement, aka the Black Lives Matter movement, is unconscious racial stereotypes. In other words, having an automatic preference for one race over another, without ever being aware of this bias. This bias can usually manifest in small interpersonal interactions, but has broader implications, especially in the legal system and other important sectors of society. Examples may include holding an implicit bias that associates Black individuals as violent. As a result, you may cross the street at night when you see a Black man walking your direction, without ever even realizing why you're crossing the street. Scientists look for many ways to prove their theories, but the tricky part about implicit biases is that they're subconscious, meaning that you do not know you have them. This became troublesome to identify until 1998, when a group of scientists created the implicit attitude test. Using the IAT, Professor Brian Nozick and his colleagues tested more than 700,000 subjects and found that more than 70% of white subjects more easily associated white faces with positive words and Black faces with negative words, concluding that this was an evidence of implicit racial bias. These results seem even more shocking nowadays with the events surrounding the death of George Floyd and many others. Both law enforcement and the legal system try to shed light on the implicit bias. An example of implicit bias functioning in law enforcement is a theory known as the shooter bias. This is a tendency among police to shoot Black civilians more than white civilians, even when both groups are unarmed. This bias has been tested multiple times in the laboratory setting, revealing an implicit biases against Black individuals. Blacks are also arrested at disproportionately higher rates, given harsher sentences, and Black juveniles also tried as adults more often than their white peers. In lieu of the recent events, the topic of implicit biases have become more concerning, especially in the legal and administrative departments. Many people wonder if society can ever put aside their biases and make fair and just decisions. Sadly, reality shows that some biases may never be extinguished. But further research proves that implicit biases can steadily be changed over time with proper education and information. This provides a bright insight for the future, which suggests that prioritizing education and dispelling stereotypes may help us solve many of the problems implicit biases causes today. Thank you very much.